Hey everybody, it's Dr. New, aka James New MD. I just had a patient of mine who actually lives in Hawaii alerted me to this mess that's been going on there with the water supply. Apparently, one of the Navy station they have there had leakage of some of their fuel into one of the wells and was only discovered 11, 12 days after knowing about the fuel leak. Now, this might sound rare, but the reality is almost any underground fuel tank eventually is going to leak, and that is going to leak somewhere, and that somewhere tends to be the groundwater. And for people that are getting their water from community wells, or if you have a private well, that can be a big problem. And it just reminded me of the importance of using some of the tools that we have at our disposal with our patients. If you have patients that have, particularly patients that have non-specific symptoms, because when you read the news releases from Hawaii, these people had nausea, or they had headaches, or they had fatigue, they had vomiting, they had diarrhea, they had abdominal pain. These are pretty non-specific symptoms, and you always need to have these kinds of exposures on your radar. Now, obviously, the test I use in my office is going to be the GPL-TOX screen. That's the first morning's urine that we run that looks at multiple markers for environmental toxins. Now, in the case of what happened in Hawaii, it's amazing that they are not testing any of these people. Part of the problem with the fuel is it depends exactly on what type of fuel you're using. But again, these are all hydrocarbons. They're all going to be derivatives of oil. And what you're going to see there, depending on which fuel, if it's actual gasoline, you can see elevation of things like MTBE on the GPL-TOX, but also remember that fuel is going to contain things like benzenes and xylene and these kinds of organic compounds. Now they've reduced all of those in the fuels over the years, but they're still there. So it begs the question. It's great for the Navy to sort of fess up that they had a leak. It was bad that it took them 11, 12 days to tell anybody that, because that's 11 or 12 days that people are drinking contaminated water. And again, this leak went into a well Navy used, but of course that connected with one of the major wells for Honolulu, for Oahu. And they have to shut the whole thing down for a few days to clear that stuff out. So when you end up having a patient in these kinds of situations, you always want to have this test on the radar. Now, I just for simplicity and to take out any, de-identify any data, I just have a couple of examples here of what the mycotox looks like. So this first page of the mycotox is going to have your MTBE. Now, MTBE is not a naturally occurring ingredient in oil. MTBE was something that was added to boost octane, is my understanding. They used to put lead in the gasoline to boost octane. They took the lead out, they put MTBE in. They since have taken out MTBE and have put in ethanol, which tends to be their octane booster now. Although there's some word that they might be bringing back some of these compounds. But like I said, the trouble with these tanks, when they looked in Hawaii, what went wrong, it was everything. I mean, they weren't checking the couplings and the piping. They weren't checking any of the piping that was in contact with or under the ground. They didn't use double wall tanks to store fuel in. All these things that would have prevented leaks. Because again, once these things leak, they're just going to filter down and eventually end up in the aquifers in the groundwater. So, and because these tanks, they've been using these underground tanks forever. I'm practicing in Michigan. We deal with a lot of elevated MTBE, because even though the stuff hasn't been used in over 10 years, it's still in the groundwater. And anybody that's getting their water off of a well is at risk of being exposed to this. And remember, a lot of community water supplies are coming from wells also. So that's your MTBE marker here. Now, this particular patient doesn't have a particularly high MTBE. I know the first time I measured my MTBE, it was in the 20,000 range. It was quite high. The other issues here, one is xylene. So this is one of the things that you're going to find in the hydrocarbon group. You're also going to get this out of exhaust. So, always remember somebody that's living, if you're living close to an air base or naval base, you don't just have to worry about is there fuel tanker leaking into your water supply. It's also the traffic of jets and the jet fuel, the exhaust that you're breathing, much more likely to see xylene there. I have lots of patients from the Far East, China, Korea, Southeast Asia, India. Almost everybody has elevation of xylene and also elevation of the benzene marker, because that is just so ubiquitous in air pollution because it's coming from burning the hydrocarbons. Now, again, it's in the hydrocarbon itself, but it also gets created by the combustion of those compounds. So again, in Michigan, we had a situation a few years ago where there was a company called Wolverine Worldwide that made shoes, and they waterproofed those shoes, and the waterproofing material had PFAS in it, and that got into the groundwater. Unfortunately, the company didn't report that. It was only discovered after there was a larger than normal number of patients with cancer. And when they went in to investigate, they tested the drinking water, and the drinking water was contaminated in multiple areas with PFAS. So that's unfortunate, because here you have to have people actually get disease before it's discovered. And we can prevent that. I mean, if we do these kinds of screenings on our patients, who isn't exposed to toxins? You don't have to, live in Honolulu next to Pearl Harbor in order to be exposed to these toxins. You can live anywhere. I mean, people in Michigan, they were living on the west side of the state. They were living in areas that were more rural and theoretically cleaner, but no, it's because of the contamination of the groundwater. They were contaminated with PFAS from it. So I just want to point this out. It's a good sort of teaching moment that the toxicity is out there. And even though occasionally we'll see these kinds of headlines, most of the toxicity is hidden. And if we don't look for it as practitioners, if we're not calling up and looking at these tox screens, and I'm not sure which patients you wouldn't want to do this on, but if we're not looking at these tox screens, we would never figure this stuff out. So again, this is a very good example of, number one, why aren't they testing patients for this stuff? They just tested the water and said, hey, don't go back to your house until the water's clean, and now you can go back to your house. But, there's no follow-up in terms of testing patients. You could very easily use this kind of testing to determine where is your patient at to start out with, and put them through some type of detox, whatever detox program you're going to use, and then retest them afterwards. And you will see significant drops in these compounds. So I hope this stuff has been helpful. It's always these situations that just sort of ding your mind and say, hey, why am I not using this test more often? And this is a perfect example of why we should be using these tests, because even though we heard about this one, like I said, the one in Michigan, we didn't hear about the water contamination for years until that contamination actually caused cancer in patients. So doing this sort of testing, picking these things up early, detoxing your patients, that's going to be the answer to long-term health for your patients. Hope this was helpful. This is Dr. New out.